I just have a few points I'd like to make. The intention is to have this be an interactive session this afternoon. So I have 3 slides here. Start out with a few generalizations. We're celebrating a 25th anniversary of the DNS, and this year is also the 10th anniversary of the formation of ICANN, which essentially was a recognition of the fact that the DNS had outgrown the administrative and technical management capacities of the federal research agencies, which had been worrying about it. Jon Postel, who was the IANA, was funded by the Defense Department. And among other things, they were not thinking that he ought to continue with this activity, which was rapidly becoming very large, even in the early to mid-90s. So first of all, the internet we have today is not the internet we started with. Paul has given you some notion about that. Vint Cerf's latest, as you know, he used to be the internet evangelist for MCI. Now he's the internet evangelist for Google. And his latest presentation says that the internet has scaled 1 million times from the introduction of TCP/IP. And it's some very large number. And of course, it's continuing to grow fairly rapidly, although I think as you think about the fact that it's less than an order of magnitude to go from where it is to the population of the planet, and then we get down into, well, how many internet gadgets can each of us have going simultaneously? So we hope that the S-curve will take hold here and the rate of growth will taper off. But it's fairly obvious that some of the characteristics that Paul described about that have made it as successful as it is, I think I'm correct in saying that we do name resolution about somewhere in the order of 20 billion times a day on the internet on a global basis. And so, and hardly anybody notices that it even happens. So that's from a technical operational standpoint, that's not too shabby. And we all certainly have a stake in having that continue. We shouldn't assume just because we've scaled successfully to where we are that we'll continue to scale successfully. In the States and also in Europe, there are organized academic efforts to look into revisiting the internet design. Paul talked about the revisiting of DNS. That's healthy. You know, the last thing that any of us want to be is end up being as fossilized as the telco engineers that we've sort of subversively done out of a job. There's a saying in the States, you know, with regard to technology, that the children eat their parents. So presumably those of us up on the stage will be eaten by our children at some point. One of the clean slate questions you might ask is, well, can we just junk this thing? Isn't there something out there that'll just do away with this thing we use 20 billion times a day? And the answer is, from most of the people who look at this, saying, no, you know, this is really way too handy, and it's way built into the system, and the system's gotten very large, and so one of the things we're not likely to do is get rid of the DNS. So we need to think about keeping the DNS healthy. If you go and ask the average user, you know, what do you want out of the domain name system, if they even have the foggiest idea what it is, the general reaction is, well, I'd like it to just work. You know, I'd like it to not bog down my machine or slow up my Google pages or screw up my YouTube videos and so on. And they also want it to be apolitical. You know, I don't want to have to go, you know, I don't want to have the Democratic Party calling me up about the domain name system. So there's some generalizations. What kind of issues fall out of that? Well, the DNS, and in particular ICANN, which has responsibility for managing it, has become very politicized. That's a result of growth and the fact that the internet is now much more of a communications medium than it was when it started, when it was primarily a academic computing medium. If you get into a system that invades people's lives in a big way, you inevitably end up in a political space. unfortunately, our multinational political institutions aren't very robust. And I say that that applies across a whole range of human activities. We see evidence of that in the morning paper every day, which really means that to the extent that ICANN is charged with a multinational coordination responsibility, that the weakness of political institutions inevitably means that ICANN itself is weak. One of the principal topics of discussion around the world, and Marcus has been very involved with this through WSIS and IGF and so on, is, well, you know, what kind of political institutions might we create to try to do something about that situation? Secondly, the U.S., of course, as you know, is renowned as the original mercantilist state. And when all else fails, we look after our economic interests. About 75 or 80% of all the economic activity in the domain name system is centered in the United States, because that's because that's where it started, and partly because most of the companies in the DNS business do business in the United States. They do business as U.S. corporations, even though they have many user clients that are international in nature, and as a result of that, they are their profits and so on are U.S. profits. And this is, as you might expect, through the Commerce Department and other governmental agencies, led to a situation in which the attitudes in Washington tend to be overly protective of the economic interests of that business because it's a U.S. business. And one of the obstacles we've had into getting a more impartial and dispassionate attitude about the DNS and ICANN and its future has been that problem. A third issue is that when the government decided to privatize the technical administration of the Internet, it sort of went through the agencies in Washington and gathered up what various pieces that people considered problems of one kind or another, and they ended up in the remit of ICANN. And in almost all ICANN-related discussions, you find yourself hopscotching around. You know, one minute you're talking about name resolution, the next minute you're talking about trademarks, you know, the next minute you're talking about the introduction of new TLDs. So as a result of that, it's been very difficult for ICANN to create and maintain focus. And in fact, focus, for instance, on how do you deal with commercial issues having to do with the registration of domain names have very little to do with the creation of socket numbers and functions that the IANA worries about, all in the same organization. A fourth issue is that the high rate of change, coupled to these other issues that we have here, creates an aura of uncertainty. Even people who are well-intentioned about ICANN and the DNS find themselves hesitating to charge into the fray, as it were, with my solution or the solution, because it's pretty clear that today's solution might very well be tomorrow's problem. That tends to accentuate the politicization and give a lot of openings to people occasionally who are excessively paranoid about ICANN's activities. Since it's, I think, useful to have some points to have some discussion about, I just put down 3 bullets for you to consider as my point of view about things we ought to do. I think we ought to plan for multinational oversight of those activities of ICANN that genuinely are multinational and require multinational cooperation. The U.S. government has said repeatedly since way back when I was a startup CEO that in the very near future, ICANN was going to be independent. ICANN is no more independent today, 10 years after, than it was when we started, and there's a variety of reasons for that. But what we need to do is to get the various parties, and in particular the U.S. government, to get serious about planning for this multinational. It's one thing to say we're going to do something, it's another to have a plan to go forward, and we really don't have anything that remotely resembles a plan for that future today. Secondly, I think that the regulatory supervision of registrars and registries is primarily economic. You know, if you stripped out all of the non-economic activities of ICANN from the organization, what you would have left is a trade association for registries and registrars, and life would be a lot simpler because we have similar economic regulation of other kinds and other industry segments and so on. So my personal view is life would get a lot better for everyone if we could separate the economic from the non-economic aspects of ICANN's mission. Thirdly, it was intended when ICANN was formed that it would have an active role in all of the responsibilities inherited from the government and are by implication at least included in our mission. But in fact, it turned out that a number of the non-U.S. players that were involved in some of those assumptions didn't see it that way at all. I can remember some marvelous emails that Dennis and I had 8-9 years ago in which basically Dennis said, and Dennis, of course, has spent a lot of time in Washington. He was the program director for NSFNet, and he knows a lot about Washington politics, and what he let me know in no uncertain terms was, Mike, the rest of the world doesn't see it like the U.S. Department of Commerce does, and so you better slow down a little bit. Well, the result of that is, for instance, that the country registry associations and their governments now are quasi-independent. Certainly much more independent was intended by the U.S. government when ICANN was formed. The same thing is true of the regional address registries. The same thing, in effect, is true of the root server operators, and particularly now that the roots servers have been so well distributed. You know, there's an attitude in some circles that reflects a glass half empty, that ICANN has failed in some fashion. My personal view is that's a glass half full. The architecture of the internet is distributed. We wouldn't have the internet today if it hadn't been designed that way. To the extent we can find functions that can be effectively distributed to responsible entities and governments, that ought to be part of our program to go forward. So that's just a few ideas from me for you.
Thank you very much.